bar encounter with the devil. When Lucifer reveals the truth. My friends are the kind of people who love those wild nights, crazy parties, a bit of coke, a couple of ecstasy pills in the bathroom, and maybe a one-night stand with someone. Then usually, they leave me a message around 10 a.m. after God knows when, saying they don't need the lift I offered them anymore. Side note, I don't mean I don't drink. I do, but clubs aren't my thing. I'm more of a pub guy, beer in hand, listening to the telly in the background, playing some random channel that some bloke from the back corner requested. I reckon that's my idea of fun. So when my mates told me they were heading out for a night on the town, I said sure. I hung out in the first club, ordering just non-alcoholic beer in case my car was needed, and pretended to have a good time. As the night went on, I saw them grinding on girls, dancing with blokes, chatting up guys who were definitely dealers. At that point, I figured my ride wasn't needed anymore. We weren't too far out of the city, and the trains were running all night. Plus, I always found my car the next day. So I wandered out of the club into something more rustic. It wasn't hard to find, not even close. I ended up at this bar called the Direct Feta. Didn't much like the name, but the drinks were cheap, and most of the patrons seemed to be middle-aged men watching footy replays. I tried to pretend I hadn't just stumbled out of a club with my ears ringing. I slicked my hair back, pulled out my phone, and headed to the bar. I ordered a double whiskey and knocked it back. Just because I wasn't in a club didn't mean I couldn't still have a good time. For a while, I sat alone at the bar, scrolling through my phone, trying to look much more impressive than I actually was. I eavesdropped on a few blokes sitting on the sofas, going wild over their footy teams. I ordered another whiskey and disappeared into the background. Naturally, late-night stragglers from clubs are common. It wasn't long before a couple of scantily clad girls wandered in, giggling and pointing at the spot they wanted to sit. I saw a guy come in, half carrying his mate who was pretty far gone, definitely smashed. He dumped his friend on one of the leather sofas, which were covered in beer stains and cigarette butts, and demanded 2 glasses of water and all the peanuts the bar had. The bartender seemed a bit amused. Some of the girls took selfies and Snapchatted their friends, who were still clubbing. They ordered shots, gearing up for their next stop. A couple of lads wandered in with some takeaway. I even spotted someone through the window munching on a Big Mac at the outdoor seating. This was a night for the young and wasted, and I was just numbing my mind a little with whiskey, watching it all without really engaging, until someone slid onto the bar stool next to me. "Do I look like a girl with daddy issues?" she asked. She was average height, though it wasn't immediately obvious since she was leaning on the bar with her arms folded. She was slim, with short, surprisingly bright red hair framing her somewhat round face, a face that was smeared with eyeliner and lipstick. Honestly, it looked like her makeup was melting off. There was a chip tangled in her hair, hanging from her forehead. The tipsy part of me really wanted to try to chat her up. She was clearly drunk, and as I looked around the pub, I couldn't quite place where she'd come from. She didn't seem to be part of the selfie group or the smashed bloke on the couch. I hoped she wasn't with any of the middle-aged men either. I tried peeking out the window to see if a group was missing a drunken redhead, but I didn't spot anyone. The window was too fogged up. It was too hot inside, too cold outside. Are you all right?" I asked her. She pointed a finger at me. "Answer my question." I wasn't sure what to say. I just looked at her awkwardly, giving her a bemused smile. The girl's lips twisted into a drunken grin. She put a hand over her mouth to stifle her laugh, but all it did was smear her lipstick even more. "I do, just so you know," she said, pressing herself against the bar. "Have daddy issues, I mean, in case that wasn't obvious." She gestured to her disheveled clothes, which had probably looked pretty spectacular when she left the house. The stains on them looked like old food, and the sticky residue on her neck and shoulders clearly pointed to a thrown drink. "What happened?" I asked, noticing her hair was tangled around her neck, probably sticky from the same substance. "Just a few run-ins, no biggie," she said, shrugging. "Course I didn't start them. Nah, I wouldn't do that." "But your dad did that to you?" She grinned widely. "Sort of. Do you want me to call someone for you?" I already had my phone in hand. The girl looked like she was barely in her early 20s, which didn't mean she couldn't be dealing with some kind of parental abuse. The only number I could think of off the top of my head was a helpline, which felt pretty inappropriate. Maybe the cops? Did I really want to call the cops while my friends were a couple of doors down snorting coke? The girl gently pressed my hand down and shook her head. No thanks, she told me. You don't need to call anyone. Her expression changed then, not the fiery look most girls in her state give you, but open, friendly, and endearing. She wanted something from me, and I felt oddly compelled to give it to her. I want something else. And what's that? I asked. I want to tell you a story, she said before glancing at the bar. And you're gonna buy me a drink, she said. The universe hurts sometimes, and I'm afraid I've lost my wallet. I laughed. I didn't know this girl, and I had no idea where she'd come from. My nights were usually spent slowly getting tipsy and making sure my friends didn't end up dead in a ditch somewhere. I was used to being hit on occasionally, but even though I was sitting on a bar stool with a whiskey in hand, I knew that wasn't what this was. This girl wasn't looking for a hookup. What she wanted was to talk. I figured that was fine with me. What do you want to drink? I asked her. She smiled. An appletini. The pub didn't offer much in the way of cocktails, but by some small miracle, I was able to order her an appletini. I got myself a cider to go with it, and suddenly, I was a little too aware of where this night might be heading. I just ordered more alcohol for an already very drunk girl, who'd clearly had a rough night. Some part of my old instinct kicked in. The same instinct that made me text my friends every few hours to make sure they hadn't wandered off somewhere dangerous. With nobody around except the bartender, who was mildly aware of our existence on these stools, I realized I was suddenly responsible for this drunk girl. She accepted her drink, wrapping her fingers carefully around the martini glass. This brings back memories, she said fondly, looking at me with sparkling green eyes. Do you know what it was originally called? Before I could answer, she grinned. An Eden's apple martini. I snorted. Yeah, I've heard that somewhere before. Of course, it wasn't really an apple, she continued, lowering her gaze to her drink. The scriptures were mistranslated, mostly because you humans don't have a word for it anymore. That fruit was exotic, and honestly, it never existed in this realm, only in Eden. She giggled dreamily. Ha ha ha, and Eden's been long gone. I stared at her. Are you okay? This time, I meant it more sincerely than I had before, especially since a slight unease was creeping into my stomach. Of course, she said, grinning widely. Why do you keep asking me that? I mean, no offense, but you look like someone threw their kebab on me and another their fish and chips, she asked, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Like you've been roughed up, beaten, and left in the gutter for rats to find, I replied. She held eye contact for an uncomfortable amount of time before her face broke into a wide grin. Yeah, something like that. Why would someone do that to you? I asked. Why wouldn't they? She answered immediately. People aren't that great, and booze usually only makes it worse, she shrugged. Sometimes it makes them better, nicer, a little looser, but mostly just annoying and a bit grumpy. I watched her down her drink. She seemed sharp enough to know how sarcastic her words were, but she didn't care to apologize for them. The girl looked back at me. You bought me a drink. Now you get to listen to my story. I nodded wordlessly. She smiled, gestured to the bartender, and pointed to her drink. He was already starting to make another. Eden, she repeated her earlier rambling, as if the words had just left her mouth. Everyone thinks it was my fault, you know, that Adam and Eve got kicked out of their perfect little nudist paradise. She threw me a knowing glance. Only in Eden could you sit naked in the grass without a pine cone getting stuck between your arse cheeks. I blinked. I'm sorry, but I don't quite understand. Apologies, she said, looking somewhat apologetic. My story doesn't make much sense if I haven't properly introduced myself. She extended her hand. Hi, my name's Lucifer, she said with a wink, but you can call me Lucy. You know that uncomfortable heat that rushes through your veins when you're deciding whether to stay or run? Adrenaline pumps through your blood, and all you want to do is get up and bolt. It overrides everything else. Suddenly, things started to make a bit more sense. The girl had to be crazy. She just had to be. She looked like she'd been through hell 4 times over in one night, and until that point, I hadn't known how that was even possible. Beneath the smeared makeup and grimy clothes, she was quite attractive, and her behavior wasn't mean or rude. But if she was walking around telling people she was the devil, that would explain why most people reacted the way they did to her. I suddenly felt the need to glance at her wrist, then further down to her ankle. Maybe she had some kind of marking from the psych ward she'd broken out of after banging her head against something hard. Was this even real? I really should have called the cops. I know what you're thinking, Lucy said, her eyes fixed on mine. You think I'm crazy and that you should run away as fast as possible. And are you? I asked her. Would I be sitting here with you, drinking apple teenies if I was? She asked, batting her eyelashes at me. Would you look the way you do if you weren't? I shot back. She grinned and clinked her glass against mine. Without thinking, I took a drink with her before frowning. She giggled and leaned in closer. Let's make a little bet, she said. Let me tell you my story, and if you believe me by the end of it, you won't try to lock me up. I stared at her. If I believe you, why would I do that? You'd be surprised what people do when they think you're the devil, she said, her grin widening. Do you do this often? I asked, half laughing. Tell people you're Satan himself? She snorted into her drink. Not as often as I should, but it's been a long, hellish day, and I just wanted a bit of conversation, if that's all right with you. I waved the bartender over for another whiskey. The girl's eyes lit up with joy. I wasn't exactly stuck with her, but part of me didn't want to leave without hearing what she had to say. Besides, I couldn't exactly let a crazy girl wander around London at night. So, I said, taking a sip. Eden. Lucy laughed. Adam and Eve, I continued. If what you're saying is true, God created 2 people from whom we all descended. Lucy raised a finger. God made 2 prototypes. My father created angels as his little toy soldiers, but he failed when he wanted to make something in his own image. After us, that was his next big project, one he spent every waking moment of his existence on, with these 2 prototypes. He gave them a perfect utopia to live in. But he wanted to test them. He wanted to know if they had free will. And did they? I asked. Lucy's face turned bitter. No. My father can't handle being defied. He tempted them with the idea of knowledge beyond their understanding and told them exactly what they had to do to claim it. But to create a being capable of breaking his laws? Oh, my father is a real control freak. He was too scared to give them that ability. Lucy was very adamant about her delusion, I realized. She spoke with such disdain for her father that I started to feel sorry for her. Only someone deeply hurt would dare challenge God himself. And then, I asked, entertained by her story, you were the one who tempted them in the Garden of Eden? All this time, the devil was a woman? She smiled. Something like that. She looked at me, raising an eyebrow. The world thinks the temptation came in the form of a serpent. The serpent's legs were supposedly taken as punishment for leading Eve to the forbidden fruit. She laughed, a short, harsh sound. Snakes never had legs, and it wasn't a sin to tempt those poor prototypes into doing what they did next. Her shoulders were tense as she took another sip, but her eyes gleamed with excitement. She seemed thrilled to be telling me all this. I was his favorite child, she said, her voice softening. My father loved and cared for me. He called me the light bringer. I stood by his side as he created the earth and while he shaped humanity. She pursed her lips and slammed her empty glass on the counter. The bartender hurried to bring her another drink. My father couldn't bring himself to go the extra mile, she continued. So, he asked me to walk among the prototypes and tempt them, guide them toward the forbidden power he had hinted at. So, you're saying God wanted us to reach for that? I asked, still skeptical. I'm saying God feared his own power and desperately wanted to share it with his creation. Right and wrong, left and right, that sort of thing. Lucy shrugged nonchalantly. Are you familiar with the story of Prometheus? I furrowed my brow for a moment. Greek, right? Something about stealing fire from the gods to help? The whiskey was starting to make things a little fuzzy, Lucy grinned. Exactly, she said, cutting me off. Prometheus stole the fire of the gods to ensure humanity could move forward. In every culture, you'll find a story about how humans gain the ability to advance, to progress, and to create. And God, I said, processing, was the creator who wanted to give that ability to his prototypes? I gave it to them, she replied, her voice flat, by tempting Eve to eat the fruit. She shrugged again, as if it were no big deal. Now the world sees me as the ultimate evil. If what you're saying is true, I said slowly, then God must be like us. Lucy's lips curled into an almost animalistic grin. My father is very selfish. Maybe he planned to create you in his full image, but in the end, all he managed to do was make your minds like his. He gave you the ability to think for yourselves. His angels, on the other hand, were his soldiers, and I was his most loyal, until that day. Angels don't have free will then? No, they don't, Lucy said with certainty. And what about the devil? I asked, now far more intrigued than I should have been. Hearing religious ideas from someone who believed they'd lived through them was probably one of the most fascinating conversations I'd ever had. Growing up, I'd only gone to church with my parents when I was a kid, but suddenly, the idea was stirring something in me. Part of me was aware of that and feared what it might lead to, but I was drunk enough not to care. The devil has free will, Lucy said, raising her glass toward me. When I led Eve to the tree, something awakened in me that day, and I realized what I'd been missing all along. The same thing my brothers and sisters were missing. We were submissive, following simply because he was our creator. But now with free will, I realized how arrogant and self-absorbed he'd become. In a single, lonely moment of passion, he decided to create his little human prototypes, only to quickly realize what it meant to give them free will. He couldn't control them anymore, I said, finishing her thought. Lucy nodded. Exactly. And soon after, he realized he couldn't control me either. So he sent you to hell? Lucy nearly choked on her drink, breaking into a grin. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I sat up straighter, feeling a bit more sober. The people around me suddenly seemed so quiet, and I didn't care anymore about what they had to say or what they were up to. The only person that interested me now was Lucy. I tried to explain to my siblings what had happened in Eden, and more importantly, what had happened to me by accident, but they wouldn't listen. They didn't understand free will. She paused, her eyes distant for a moment, then continued, they couldn't comprehend the idea of going against his word, because for them, it was law. But for me, I saw something else, something bigger. And that's when the rebellion happened? I asked, leaning in closer. Lucy smiled sadly. It wasn't really a rebellion, not in the way people think. It was more of an awakening. I tried to show them that they could be more than just soldiers, that they could make their own choices, but they were too afraid of the consequences. She took a deep breath, her voice lowering. And so I fell. Not because I was evil, but because I dared to think for myself. There was a moment of silence between us. The weight of her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and despite the absurdity of the situation, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth to what she was saying, or at least, she truly believed it. So you didn't start the war in heaven? Lucy shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. No, the war was inevitable. Once I realized I had free will, there was no turning back, and my father, well, he couldn't handle the fact that one of his creations had defied him. Her gaze softened. I wasn't cast down because I was evil. I was cast down because I was different, because I dared to be more than what he wanted me to be. I stared at her, my mind racing. And now? Lucy shrugged again, her nonchalance returning. Now, I watch. I wait. I see how humanity struggles with the same questions I once did. Free will, destiny, good and evil. It's all a cycle, really. She leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto mine. And you, sitting here listening to my story, do you believe me? I didn't know what to say. My head was spinning from the whiskey and the sheer weight of everything she'd told me. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to chalk it up to the ramblings of a drunken girl in a pub. But another part of me, a part I hadn't realized existed, was starting to question everything I thought I knew. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucy smiled, a knowing smile, as if she'd expected that answer all along. That's all right, she said softly. Not everyone is ready to hear the truth. She finished her drink, stood up, and smoothed out her wrinkled clothes. But when you are, you'll know where to find me. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the pub, leaving me sitting there, stunned and unsure of what had just happened. How could they understand? I only understood because it was accidentally given to me. At that time, I didn't even know I had it. I just suddenly became aware of all our father's mistakes. My siblings, though, they couldn't see his flaws, so they assumed I had turned bitter and rebelled against him, exposing our father's deception of ruling over us. Oh, she sighed heavily. Adam, Eve, and all his creations that followed were cast out of his perfect little utopia once they had his knowledge. My father feared what he had done. After what happened to me, I could understand his fear and loneliness that led him to use me in the first place. Lucy's gaze dropped, her sadness almost tangible. I thought, she continued, that he would spend even more time with me than before. After all, we were more alike than any of his other children. But he grew distant, quiet. He would toy with his little humans from time to time, but for the most part, he condemned them, blamed them for his own weakness. She smiled weakly. He blamed me. Lucy's story was transforming into that of a child with a cruel, abusive father. I knew many kids with similar stories, and now I began to fear how much truth was entwined with her tale. I'd heard it's easier to escape into fantasy when you've been mistreated, and I wondered if that was the reason for her story, her desperation to share it with me, a complete stranger. I respected the bet. Whether I liked her or not, I felt compelled to hear her story in full before I tried to judge or unravel it. I sat quietly, waiting for her to continue as she toyed with her last drink. I slowly came to understand, Lucy said after a long pause, that I no longer belonged in heaven. I couldn't follow my father's plans because I realized he didn't have any. My siblings refused to see reason, so many of them eventually stood against me, led by my father. He told me what I already feared, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. He said I no longer belonged to him or them. I wasn't an angel anymore. I wasn't his lightbringer, his Lucifer. I was a mutation of his will. And so, he took the grace of God from me, and I fell. A long silence settled between us, broken only when the bartender poured us 2 more drinks. Lucy downed hers reflexively, but I didn't touch mine. I'm scared, Lucy said softly. This is usually the point where people want to punch me in the face. Why? I asked, trying to follow her metaphor. Because your father kicked you out? Or, I guess, threw you into hell? Lucy chuckled sadly. Oh, you humans. My father gave you his way of thinking, and now look at you, she said, shaking her head. No, not because he threw me into hell. Why then? I fell to earth, Lucy explained. Father gave me dominion over a place he thought I belonged. After all, humans like me had free will. What's the saying? It was a match made in heaven. She snorted darkly. Of course, that wasn't quite right. When I fell, I was confronted with a humanity that was nothing like Father's little prototypes. Her tone had shifted. There was anger in her words now, and it started to scare me. I saw emperors and kings, governments and churches. I saw corporations that claimed to be rulers, presidents, and fat dictators. I watched humanity fight and lose and ultimately give up. They were no longer able to face the greed and responsibility placed upon them. There was simply too much to change, and people quickly realized they weren't as free as they thought. She clicked her tongue. I started to despise all of you. Then, she took another long swig of her drink. I understand what you mean, I said, allowing my gaze to wander over the others in the bar for the first time since meeting her. I looked at the women playing with their phones, the guys desperately trying to sober up, the men engrossed in their football match. We all led different lives, but we were all here, drinking ourselves into oblivion, losing ourselves in distractions. It wasn't the first time I'd wondered what we were trying to cover up, and I knew I wasn't the only one with those thoughts. You hide behind alcohol, pathetic decisions, and pretend you have free will, Lucy said, waving her hand across the room. No one paid attention to us. It's true, Father gave you the will to make your own choices. But you waste it. The free will you were gifted, the free will I only got by accident. You all turn it into a joke. You follow leaders mindlessly without questioning them. You obey laws written centuries ago that no longer make sense. You do these things because you've given up on following your own will, not because of any external force. But not all of us are like that, right? I asked, trying to defend our species against this angry young woman. You see it all the time in the news. People stand up, we protest. Humans can make a difference. Lucy laughed bitterly and tapped the edge of her glass. Really, she said. You sit here, claiming not everyone can be bad because a few refuse to conform. Those you call rebels, they make the difference for all of you. She grinned, lifting her glass. By that logic, I'm the greatest rebel of all. Should I now fix all your mistakes? By your logic, I said, you should be punishing us. Isn't that what this metaphor is about? I laughed, unable to stop myself, and took a drink. Is that the point of your story, to tell me we're all going to hell? I asked. If so, I can understand why people want to punch you. Lucy didn't say a word. She just stared at me, and I felt uneasy under her gaze. There was an intelligence in her eyes far beyond anyone I usually met in a bar at midnight. The alcohol was no longer present in her eyes, and her face wasn't as flushed. Even her makeup didn't reflect the chaos I'd seen when she first appeared on the stool next to me. It was as if I was sitting across from someone entirely different, and it scared me. Let's recap what you said. Lucy spoke slowly, no longer slurring her words. Had she ever been slurring? You believe I'm telling you humanity is doomed because they've squandered the gift of free will. Her nails dug into the bar. My father once guided me, but I paid the price for his mistakes. I am seen as the one responsible for your punishment, but that was never the case. You are responsible for what you do here, not me. She pursed her lips and tapped the bar, signaling the bartender for another drink. Tell me, she said, did I ever mention hell in my story, or was that just you? I opened my mouth to answer, but something made me stop. My lips trembled, and I closed them again. Lucy smiled and took a sip. She looked away, lazily scanning the room. What I said was something actually mentioned in your scriptures. My father gave me dominion over earth, a place full of free will doomed to be wasted. Her lips curled into a sneer. Humans sin all the time, not because of me, not because of evil or my reign over this place. In fact, I don't lift a finger, do I? Because I see no reason to. What do you mean? I asked, suddenly desperate. Exactly what you think, Lucy replied, raising her glass. I clinked mine against hers, but she laughed softly, a light, airy laugh. I had so many plans for your species, she said. I wanted us to enjoy our free will together and create a place free from the cruelty and power my father imposed on the angels. I wanted to create a true utopia. But, alas, you didn't want that, she shrugged. My father sent me here, thinking I could become one of you, but all I learned is that you've inherited more from him than he ever intended. Stop it, this isn't funny anymore. Of course it isn't funny, Lucy said, her grin widening, emphasizing the sick irony. Humans punish themselves by watching and doing nothing. You've created your own hell, and do you know the worst part? She didn't wait for me to ask what she meant. The worst part is, some of you are so blind you believe this life is heaven. Lucy didn't wait for me to ask another question. She kept going. The rich and powerful, those who stand above you all, they get a taste of a good life. That's right, then they die, and they don't go to hell. They come back to earth, to your self-made hell. She tapped her temple. You following me? Reincarnation? Reincarnation, Lucy repeated quickly, practically purring the word. A nice little trick to ensure your souls stay here forever. Every now and then, a few of you get a taste of a good life. Haha, a handful of you at a time. And that's enough to make you believe this is a middle ground, that you don't live in hell every day. Then, you die, in one moment, and you wake up in another body, facing the realities of hell all over again. But of course, you never remember the time you spent in a better life. A part of you just has a hunch, hopes, prays even, and that's it. That hope lets you believe things can get better. She slammed her glass against the bar, so hard it shattered. I did nothing, even as glass shards scattered across my hands. I could only stare at her, a chill spreading through my chest. In this bar, nobody else mattered in that moment, but that was exactly what she had been saying all along, wasn't it? No one noticed. They were trapped in their own reality, their own hell. The bartender didn't even clean up the mess. The glass remained, remnants of Lucy's words laying heavy on the wood surface. It doesn't get better, Lucy spat. You're stuck in a loop until you do something about it. Otherwise, you'll never be free. None of you will, and I'm not going to do anything to help you. How? I asked, I didn't know when I had started seeing more than just a girl in front of me, but there was a fear growing inside me, threatening to tear me apart. I stared at the bright-haired figure before me and saw something more than a girl in her early 20s. I saw more than a girl suffering under her father's hand. I saw a fallen angel. I saw scars buried so deep they were almost invisible. I saw something I could never put into words, no matter how long I lived. How do we change all of this? I pleaded. But Lucy gave me no answer. I didn't blame her. Blame was thrown around so often that I knew it made her sick of being blamed for our failures. So I changed my approach. Why me? It was an honest question, and I knew Lucifer respected that. That's why she said this. When you first saw me, you were worried about my safety. When I told you I was the devil, you wanted to lock me away, but only because you were still concerned for my safety, not your own. You didn't want to hurt me, not even when I told you who I was, and that I could change your pathetic lives. You're a good person, but I'm afraid that doesn't mean much if you don't have the will to change things. She smiled at me with sympathy. The devil feeling sympathy for a man sitting across from her. For a moment, it was incredibly surreal. I honestly thought I must have died. There was no other way to explain what was happening to me, who I was talking to, or what I was hearing. What should I do? Lucy reached out and placed her hand on my shoulder. Her hand was cold and warm at the same time. I could feel my blood start to boil where her fingers touched me, and I knew it. Sharing a story like this isn't easy. Hell, it's probably the hardest thing I've ever done. The good news is, there's no such thing as hell, right? The truth is simple. The world is a mess because we refuse to change anything. The devil herself walks among us and she wants to make our lives better, but she won't. She won't because we don't want her to. We have to prove our will before she'll even consider doing anything. We have to be good to each other to help ourselves, to be free. Of course, Lucifer did tell me one last thing before she left the bar. A thing that will stick in my mind until this body is nothing but bones in the dirt. You can tell as many people as you want, she said. But look closely at me. Tonight, I've told the same story to 5 other people, just like I've told it to you. And do you know how they reacted? They hurt me, burned me, threw their food and drinks at me. People are afraid of their free will, and they find it so much easier to hurt than to face their own shortcomings. You will only be free when you stop seeing yourselves as my Father sees himself. That's what I'm leaving you with now.